All right, welcome back to the channel. And in this episode, we're going to be going over servo horns for the rear of the 64. And we're also going to be talking about low profile servos for the rear of the 64 and why this is such an important detail when going over your build. Let's get into it. All right, so in the process of going over these builds here, I'm trying out a bunch of different servo horns and coming into complications when it comes to clearance. Now, in the rear of the 64, there is some seriously tight clearance when it comes to the servo horns and what you can fit in there and still attach the shock to and clear everything without cutting. Now, if you're going to go with extended horns, like 1.5 inch or 2 inches like these bad boys here, or you're going to have to cut the chassis, so this isn't really a big issue. But if you want to get servo horns that are going to clear everything without having to hack the chassis up, and then if you change something later on, it's cut up now, so you have to, myself personally, if you're going with a build where you don't want to have anything cut up, this is important. If you're going to be cutting up the chassis, it doesn't really matter. All right, so clearance in the rear of the 64 is a serious issue and something to be considered when making your build. Now, if you're fine with cutting the chassis, you're gonna put like 2-inch long servo horns on there. You're gonna have no choice but to cut the chassis, so it's not really a big issue. But if you're doing a regular build where you don't want to actually hack up the chassis for a different servo horn that you're gonna use, this is gonna be important for that. The clearances are very, very tight, and there's a few different details when it comes to working with those clearances. One's going to be the size of the servo, whether it's a standard size servo or a low profile size servo. This will adjust the position of the servo horn, and then of course the servo horns themselves and how they're designed, how they come out from the actual servo, and how the servo is mounted too. All right, now looking at these servo horns from the ground, like the flat level, you can see the original basically goes right flat from the gear base, and the dual sky blue ones here, they do the same thing. And these ones you can get from 1.5, 1.75, and 2 inch, all the exact same, just longer or shorter. So as far as keeping that where the shock mounts as close to the gear as possible helps us with those clearances quite a bit. The other servo horns, even these red ones, they're low profile servo horns, but they're still slightly move the mounting position out, so that needs to be taken into consideration. Now, as far as how high they go versus original, it's right around the same place as where the gear would mount. Hold on. But there's that slight difference. So these are a little bit lower profile than the original, but not as low profile as the blue ones. So every millimeter counts when it comes to this clearance. Now, when we go to the silver one over here, these regular servos, that is way out there. So that's how far outwards it's going to push that shock mounting. Now, with the low profile servo, like we said before, like we've seen, it'll still fit, but that's not going to fit with a standard size servo. So like servo horns like this, they're not going to be an option. You're going to run into clearance issues with standard size servos. It will still fit, but only with a low profile servo. I also got to mention that when it comes to putting these servo horns in the rear and mounting either scale look shocks or the original shocks, one thing that we have to take into consideration is the mounting point is not going to screw through the original factory screws. These are, I think, 1.5 or 2mm screws, and the originals are M3. So the problem with that is there's no servo horns that are going to be longer, that are that small of a screw. So basically the only way around it is to do the screw and nut. So you basically screw in a screw and throw a nut. You also have to have a washer in there or a spacer in order to make sure that the spring itself clears the servo horn when going up. So that contributes to our clearance issues. We need to have enough room for the screw to pass the side of the chassis over here, and we need to have enough room for the bolt to pass the inside of the chassis over here. But thankfully the chassis does have like a little indent on the inside, which gives us that room for most cases to pass that bolt through there. So that's also one of the things we need to take into consideration, and because it's going to be loose inside there, we use the bolt on the other side to lock it up. Now, as you can see here, that shit's solid. It's not moving around at all because it's locked in with the bolt on one side, the washer on the other side, and it's on a pivot ball. So there's nothing binding it up or causing it to be tight on there. So we need to use the original screws through the larger hole on all these servo horns that we have, and the bolt on the other side is the way we get that done, as you can see on my other build too. So these things, when you're looking at servo horns online, there's a lot of differences in how they're positioned versus how Redcat chose their servo horn for this application, and it's very, very tight clearances inside the chassis there. So there's a lot of things that need to be considered when making your choices for servos and servo horns. The first things we need to take into consideration is the size of the servo that we're going to be using. The reason this is important is because when it comes to the original servo, these 25 kg here, they mount into the chassis the same as a standard size servo. So even though these ones here look like they're a little bit lower, when they actually mount into the servo, into the chassis, the servo gear is basically at the same position as the original factory servos. These standard servos, these are basically the same, the standard size servos that you get on the market. The Reefs 300 is the same size. What else? Yeah, pretty much most servos that are sold as standard size, this is going to be the size that they are, and it's basically going to have the gear position the same place as the original factory servo. There are also these low profile servos. Now this is a low profile. These ones that I run in the back of both my chassis are low profile servos, and the reason I do this is because when the low profile servo is mounted inside the chassis, it moves the gear down a couple millimeters. A couple millimeters, while it doesn't seem like a lot, that gives us a good more clearance room to put in an aftermarket servo horn that we like, that's going to go with our build, something either silver, red, or where are my blue ones? Silver, red, or blue. The first thing that I do is I run these low profile servos because that gives us more room. Now if you look over here, we have a standard size servo, and a standard size servo with these aluminum horns that we can get in all different colors that are the same length as the original. So when you have like a factory servo horn, that's going to work basically the exact same as the original. It's not going to move the the shock in or out. It's going to be the same as original. But the problem with these is that inside a standard size servo, they touch the chassis on the inside over here. So when you're going up and down, it's not a big rub, but it's definitely, there's a rubbing going on there. The same servo on a low profile servo fits no problem. So let's see over here, we have a good few millimeters clearance, and that's able to operate no problem. So this is the way how it clears with a low profile servo versus how it clears with a standard size servo rubbing on the chassis. We have to realize that this is going to be moving around the position of the shock and how the shock is mounted to the end of the servo horn. As you can see with this one here, if I didn't have a low profile servo like it is over here, and I tried to mount the actual shock, it's not going to clear the chassis on the inside. So you actually need the low profile, not just to clear over here, but also so that the shock will clear on this side over here. So if you move the mounting position too far outward, you have clearance issues on this side for the servo on the inside, and you also have clearance for the shock rubbing the side of the chassis over here. So running with a low profile servo solves both those problems there. We also have other options for servo horns. So this right here is a low profile servo with a low profile servo horn, and as you can see, we have a bunch of clearance. Now this is a longer than stock servo. This is a 1.5 inch. At 1.5 inch, I'll show you the difference. So 1.5 inch versus what would be a standard size servo horn is not a very large difference. But when you see it inside the chassis, it does give you that little bit of extra lift. As you can see, it does stick out further than over here and just barely clears. So this is basically the largest size servo that you can fit without cutting up the chassis. A lot of these servo horns, when you're shopping for them, you got to see how far they stick out from the servo gear and how the shock is mounted. So what I found is these low profile servo horns, and I'm going to put all the links in the description for these red ones. I also found these longer blue ones. These are 2-inch ones if you're going to go for that big build. And we have the red ones there. So we have the red option, we have the blue option, and we have a silver option if you're going for big. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find a neutral color like silver for these 1.5 inch low profile servos, either in this type style or that type style, which are both actually the same overall basically design. This is what I have running in the blue car over here. We have 1.5 inch, so they fit the original chassis, no cutting. And they're a low profile servo with a low profile servo horn. And I'll put the links for these ones inside the description also. And the best that I can suggest, if you don't have a build that's either going to be in highlighted with red or blue, is you can strip the anodize off of them, then polish the aluminum, and then you have a polished aluminum part instead of the blue or red. And in this case, you can either go with the blue one or the red one, because once you strip off the anodizing, it's going to be raw aluminum, and then once you have raw aluminum, you can go ahead and polish that to a mirror shine, and then it'll fit with pretty much any build. However, there's extra steps that are going to be involved if blue or red do not go with the build style that you're going. Now, the good thing about these low profile servo horns, is you can still use these on a standard size chassis. Like these servo horns here, you can't use them unless you're running a low profile servo. These servo horns here, you can still run these if you have standard size servos. Same thing with the blue ones. You can still run these if you have standard size servos. Obviously, the clearance is not going to be as much, and it's going to be very, very tight. But because the servo horn itself is low profile, it will position the shock basically the exact same place that it would be if it was with a standard size servo and the original servo horn. But these ones here, at the end of the day, because it's flat on the bottom, they give you the absolute best clearance in all cases. The only thing is, they're blue. So if you do want to run them in a car that doesn't have blue, you're going to need to strip the aluminum and polish them after. I mean, you can polish them and they'll be mirror finished. It's like polished aluminum. But those are extra steps you got to put in order to do that. But for the most part, these are the best servo horns to run in these lowriders as far as clearance issues. And you also, one of the cool things with these is you can choose different lengths. These are 1.75. The ones in there are 1.5 inch. I also have those in the rear of the Monty, but those are 2 inch. So they have a lot of different size options. They're just all in blue. So I'm going to give the links in the description for all these servo horns, just so you can see the different options that you have and the differences between them as far as clearance goes. I mean, you can see on the kits in the video here that, you know, low profile servo plus low profile servo horns is going to get you the most clearance for trying to not cut the chassis. Now, as far as these ones here, because they're a millimeter coming out from the gear versus the blue ones, as we showed you, are flat on the bottom, there is a slight bit of rubbing where I've had to sand the chassis a little bit just to get that to clear. As you can see here, oof, it's so close. It's so very close. Now, with the blue servo horns, it's going to move this position that's mounted 1 millimeter further this way, and it's not going to have the rubbing issues with the side of the chassis over here. So really, these clearances are super, super tight. The only ones that I've had the absolute perfect clearance with these 1.5 inch servos is these blue ones, because they run flat off the bottom. Even though it's extended slightly at 1.5 inch, everything clears barely, but without any sanding or any modifying the chassis whatsoever. So yeah, on this chassis over here, coming up in future updates, we're going to be cutting up this chassis and sticking on some 2 inch servo horns. Pretty sure we're going to go with these ones here. Booyah. And yeah, that's going to be for another build. With that, I hope I've just helped give some information on how to get past these clearance issues with these 64 chassis and that tight ass rear end. Well, it's going to be the 64 and 59 both going to have the same thing to deal with when it comes to clearance issues in the back. So I hope this helps some people out and gives you guys some options for decking out the back end and not running into problems during the build that just create headaches. So with that, I do appreciate all the likes, subscribe, and shares, and I'll see you in the next video.